The Premature Burial by Edgar Allan Poe, narrated for you in both Serbian and English. Please remember to check our extensive playlist section to find great audiobooks for all the languages you are studying. Now please enjoy the reading. There are certain themes of which the interest is all-absorbing, but which are too entirely horrible for the purposes of legitimate fiction. Postoje izvesne teme, čiji je interes sveobuhvatan, ali koje su suviše strašne za svrhe legitimne fikcije. These the mere romanticist must eschew, if he do not wish to offend or to disgust. Puki romantičar mora da ih izbegava ukoliko ne želi da uvredi ili odgnuši. They are with propriety handled only when the severity and majesty of truth sanctify and sustain them. Sa pristojnošću se sa njima može postupati samo onda kada ih ozbiljnost I veličanstvenost istine posvećuju I podupiru. We thrill, for example, with the most intense of pleasurable pain over the accounts of the passage of the Berezina, of the earthquake at Lisbon, of the plague at London, of the massacre of St. Bartholomew, or of the stifling of the 123 prisoners in the black hole at Calcutta. Uzbuđujemo se, na primer, sa najintenzivnijim osjećajem prijatnog bola nad izveštajima o prelasku preko Berezine, o zemljotresu u Lisabonu, o kugi u Londonu, o masakru na Sveti Vartolomej ili o gušenju 123 zatvorenika u Crnoj rupi u Kalkuti. But in these accounts it is the fact, it is the reality, it is the history which excites. Ali u tim pripovestima ono što uzbuđuje jeste činjenica, jeste stvarnost, jeste istorija. As inventions, we should regard them with simple abhorrence. Kao izmišljotine, gledali bismo na njih sa prostim gađenjem. I have mentioned some few of the more prominent and august calamities on record. But in these, it is the extent, not less than the character of the calamity, which so vividly impresses the fancy. Pomenuo sam svega nekoliko istaknutih I uzvišenih zabeleženih katastrofa, ali u njima je to obim, ne manje nego karakter katastrofe, ono što tako živo ostavlja utisak na maštu. I need not remind the reader that from the long and weird catalogue of human miseries, I might have selected many individual instances more replete with essential suffering than any of these vast generalities of disaster. Ne moram podsjećati čitaoca da bih iz dugog I čudnog kataloga ljudskih beda mogao da odaberem mnoge pojedinačne primere ispunjenije suštinskim patnjama nego išta od tih ogromnih uopštavanja katastrofe. The true wretchedness, indeed, the ultimate woe, is particular, not diffuse. Istinska beda, zaista, krajnja nesreća, jeste posebna, a nerazlivena. That the ghastly extremes of agony are endured by man the unit, and never by man the mass. For this let us thank a merciful God. To što strašne krajnosti agonije podnosi čovek jedinka, a nikada čovek masa, za to zahvalimo milosrdnom Bogu. To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. Biti živ zakopan jeste, bez sumnje, najstrašnija od tih krajnosti koja je ikada pripala u udeo pukoj smrtnosti. That it has frequently, very frequently, so fallen will scarcely be denied by those who think. To da se to često, vrlo često, tako I dešavalo, teško da će poreći oni koji misle. The boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Granice koje dele život od smrti u najboljem slučaju su neuhvatljive I neodređene. Who shall say where the one ends and where the other begins? Ko da kaže gde se jedno završava, a gde drugo počinje? We know that there are diseases in which occur total cessations of all the apparent functions of vitality, and yet in which these cessations are merely suspensions, properly so called. Znamo da postoje bolesti u kojima dolazi do potpunog zastoja svih vidljivih funkcija života, a u kojima ipak ta zastajanja nisu ništa drugo nego suspenzije, u pravom smislu te reči. They are only temporary pauses in the incomprehensible mechanism. One su samo privremeni zastanci u neshvatljivom mehanizmu. A certain period elapses, and some unseen mysterious principle again sets in motion the magic pinions and the wizard wheels. Prolazi izvesno vreme i neki nevidljiv tajanstven princip ponovo pokreće čarobne zupčanike i veštačarske točkove. The silver cord was not forever loosed, nor the golden bowl irreparably broken. Srebrna nit nije zauvek prekinuta, niti je zlatna čaša nepovratno slomljena. But where, meantime, was the soul? Ali gde je u međuvremenu bila duša? Apart, however, from the inevitable conclusion, a priori, that such causes must produce such effects, that the well-known occurrence of such cases of suspended animation must naturally give rise, now and then, to premature interments. Apart from this consideration, we have the direct testimony of medical and ordinary experience to prove that a vast number of such interments have actually taken place. Osim, međutim, neizbežnog zaključka, a priori, da takvi uzroci moraju proizvoditi takve posljedice, da dobro poznate pojave takvih slučajeva prirodne smrti moraju prirodno, s vremena na vreme, dovoditi do prevremenog sahranjivanja. Osim ovog razmatranja, imamo direktno svedočanstvo medicinskog i običnog iskustva, koje dokazuje da je ogroman broj takvih sahrana zaista i održan. I might refer at once, if necessary, to 100 well-authenticated instances. Mogao bih odmah, ako je potrebno, da uputim na 100 dobro potvrđenih slučajeva. One of very remarkable character, and of which the circumstances may be fresh in the memory of some of my readers, occurred not very long ago in the neighboring city of Baltimore, where it occasioned a painful, intense, and widely extended excitement. Jedan izuzetno upečatljivog karaktera, a čije okolnosti mogu biti sveže u sećanju nekih mojih čitalaca, dogodio se ne tako davno u susednom gradu Baltimoru, gde je izazvao bolno, intenzivno i široko rasprostranjeno uzbuđenje. The wife of one of the most respectable citizens, a lawyer of eminence and a member of Congress, was seized with a sudden and unaccountable illness, which completely baffled the skill of her physicians. Supruga jednog od najuglednijih građana, istaknutog advokata i člana kongresa, obuzeta je iznenadnom i neobjašnjivom bolešću, koja je potpuno nadmudrila veštinu njenih lekara. After much suffering, she died, or was supposed to die. Posle mnogo patnje, umrla je, ili se mislilo da je umrla. No one suspected, indeed, or had reason to suspect that she was not actually dead. Niko zaista nije sumnjao, niti je imao razloga da sumnja, da ona zapravo nije mrtva. She presented all the ordinary appearances of death. Pokazivala je sva obična spoljašnja obeležja smrti. The face assumed the usual pinched and sunken outline. Lice je poprimilo uobičajen izboran i upao izgled. The lips were of the usual marble pallor. Usne su bile uobičajeno blede poput mermera. The eyes were lusterless. Oči su bile bez sjaja. There was no warmth. Nije bilo toplote. Pulsation had ceased. Puls je prestao. For 3 days the body was preserved unburied, during which it had acquired a stony rigidity. Telo je 3 dana čuvano nesahranjeno, tokom kojih je steklo kamenastu ukočenost. The funeral, in short, was hastened on account of the rapid advance of what was supposed to be decomposition. Sahrana je, ukratko, ubrzana zbog brzog napredovanja onoga za šta se smatralo da je raspadanje. The lady was deposited in her family vault, which, for 3 subsequent years, was undisturbed. Dama je položena u porodičnu grobnicu, koja naredne 3 godine nije dirana. At the expiration of this term, it was opened for the reception of a sarcophagus, but alas, how fearful a shock awaited the husband who personally threw open the door. Po isteku tog roka, otvorena je radi prijema sarkofaga, ali avaj, kakav strašan šok je čekao muža, koji je lično otvorio vrata. As its portals swung outwardly back, some white appareled object fell rattling within his arms. Kada su se portali zaljuljali i otvorili navolje, neki belo obučen predmet upao je zvekećući u njegove ruke. It was the skeleton of his wife in her yet unmolded shroud. To je bio skelet njegove supruge u njenom još uvek neistrulelom pogrebnom ogrtaču. A careful investigation rendered it evident that she had revived within 2 days after her entombment, that her struggles within the coffin had caused it to fall from a ledge or shelf to the floor, where it was so broken as to permit her escape. Pažljivom istragom postalo je očigledno da je ona oživela u roku od 2 dana nakon svog sahranjivanja, da su njena grčanja unutar kovčega prouzrokovala da on padne sa police na pod, gde se tako razlupao da joj je omogućio bekstvo. A lamp which had been accidentally left, full of oil, within the tomb, was found empty. It might have been exhausted, however, by evaporation. Lampa koja je slučajno ostavljena, puna ulja, unutar grobnice nađena je prazna. Mogla je, međutim, biti iscrpljena isparavanjem. On the uttermost of the steps which led down into the dread chamber was a large fragment of the coffin, with which it seemed that she had endeavored to arrest attention by striking the iron door. Na najnižoj stepenici koja je vodila dole u strašnu odaju nalazio se veliki komad kovčega, kojim je, činilo se, ona pokušavala da privuče pažnju, udarajući u gvozdena vrata. While thus occupied, she probably swooned, or possibly died, through sheer terror, and in falling, her shroud became entangled in some ironwork which projected interiorly. Dok je bila tako zauzeta, verovatno je onesvestila, ili je možda umrla, od samog terora. I padajući, njen pogrebni ogrtač se upleo u neku gvozdenu konstrukciju koja je virila iznutra. Thus she remained, and thus she rotted, erect. Tako je i ostala, i tako je istrulela uspravna. In the year 1810, a case of living inhumation happened in France, attended with circumstances which go far to warrant the assertion that truth is indeed stranger than fiction. Godine 1810. U Francuskoj se dogodio slučaj živog ukopavanja, praćen okolnostima koje u velikoj meri opravdavaju tvrdnju da je istina zaista čudnija od fikcije. The heroine of the story was a Mademoiselle Victorine Lafourcade, a young girl of illustrious family, of wealth, and of great personal beauty. Junakinja priče bila je izvesna Mademoiselle Victorine Lafourcade, mlada devojka iz slavne porodice, bogata i velike lične lepote. Among her numerous suitors was Julien Bossuet, a poor litterateur or journalist of Paris. Među njenim brojnim proscima bio je Julien Bossuet, siromašan literata ili novinar iz Pariza. His talents and general amiability had recommended him to the notice of the heiress, by whom he seems to have been truly beloved. But her pride of birth decided her, finally, to reject him and to wed a Monsieur Renel, a banker and a diplomatist of some eminence. Njegovi talenti i opšte prijatno ophođenje preporučili su ga u pažnju naslednice, koja ga je, čini se, istinski volela. Ali ponosnost na svoje poreklo opredelila ju je konačno da ga odbaci i da se uda za izvesnog Monsieur Renela, bankara i diplomatu izvesnog ugleda. After marriage, however, this gentleman neglected and perhaps even more positively ill-treated her. Posle braka, međutim, taj gospodin je, zanemarivao I možda je čak I otvorenije zlostavljao. Having passed with him some wretched years, she died. At least her conditions so closely resembled death as to deceive everyone who saw her. Provedavši s njim nekoliko jadnih godina, umrla je, ili je barem njeno stanje tako nalikovalo na smrt, da je zavaralo svakoga koju je video. She was buried, not in a vault, but in an ordinary grave in the village of her nativity. Sahranjena je ne u grobnicu, nego u običan grob u selu svog rođenja. Filled with despair, and still inflamed by the memory of a profound attachment, the lover journeys from the capital to the remote province in which the village lies, with the romantic purpose of disinterring the corpse and possessing himself of its luxuriant tresses. Ispunjen očajem I još uvek raspaljen sećanjem na duboku privrženost, ljubavnik putuje iz prestonice u udaljenu provinciju u kojoj selo leži, sa romantičnom namerom da ekshumira leš I da dođe do posešen njene bujne kose. He reaches the grave. Stiže do groba. At midnight, he unearths the coffin, opens it, and is in the act of detaching the hair when he is arrested by the unclosing of the beloved eyes. U ponoć iskopava kovčeg, otvara ga I u činu odvajanja kose, kada ga zaustavlja otvaranje voljenih očiju. In fact, the lady had been buried alive. Zapravo, dama je bila živa sahranjena. Vitality had not altogether departed, and she was aroused by the caresses of her lover from the lethargy which had been mistaken for death. Životna snaga nije potpuno nestala, I ona je probuđena nežnostima svog ljubavnika iz letargije koju su pogrešno uzeli za smrt. He bore her frantically to his lodgings in the village. Grčevito je odneo u svoje prenoćište u selu. He employed certain powerful restoratives suggested by no little medical learning. Primenio je izvesne snažne lekove koje je predložilo nemalo medicinsko znanje. In fine, she revived. Ukratko, ona se oporavila. She recognized her preserver. Prepoznala je svog spasitelja. She remained with him until, by slow degrees, she fully recovered her original health. Ostala je s njim, sve dok postepeno nije potpuno povratila svoje izvorno zdravlje. Her woman's heart was not adamant, and this last lesson of love sufficed to soften it. Njeno žensko srce nije bilo od čelika, I ta posljednja lekcija ljubavi bila je dovoljna da ga omekša. She bestowed it upon Bossuet. Podarila ga je Bossuetu. She returned no more to her husband, but concealing from him her resurrection, fled with her lover to America. Više se nije vratila mužu, nego je skrivajući od njega svoje vaskrsenje, pobegla sa ljubavnikom u Ameriku. 20 years afterward, the two returned to France, in the persuasion that time had so greatly altered the lady's appearance that her friends would be unable to recognize her. 20 godina kasnije, dvojica su se vratila u Francusku u uverenju da je vreme toliko promenilo damin izgled da je njeni prijatelji ne bi mogli prepoznati. They were mistaken, however, for at the first meeting, Monsieur Renel did actually recognize and make claim to his wife. Grešili su, međutim, jer je na prvom susretu Monsieur Renel zaista prepoznao I potražio svoju ženu. This claim she resisted, and a judicial tribunal sustained her in her resistance, deciding that the peculiar circumstances, with the long lapse of years, had extinguished, not only equitably, but legally, the authority of the husband. Ovaj zahtev ona je odbila I sudski tribunal ju je podržao u njenom otporu, odlučivši da su posebne okolnosti uz dugi protok godina ugasile ne samo pravično, nego I zakonski autoritet muža. The Chirurgical Journal of Leipzig, a periodical of high authority and merit, which some American bookseller would do well to translate and republish, records in a late number a very distressing event of the character in question. Chirurški žurnal iz Leipziga, periodična publikacija visokog autoriteta i vrednosti, koju bi neki američki knjižar dobro uradio da prevede i ponovo objavi, beleži u nedavnom broju jedan veoma uznemirujući događaj karaktera o kome je reč. An officer of artillery, a man of gigantic stature and of robust health, being thrown from an unmanageable horse, received a very severe contusion upon the head, which rendered him insensible at once. The skull was slightly fractured, but no immediate danger was apprehended. Artiljerijski oficir, čovek gigantskog rasta i robusnog zdravlja, bačen sa konja koji se nije dao obuzdati, zadobio je veoma ozbiljnu kontuziju glave, koja ga je odmah onesvestila. Lobanja je bila blago prelomljena, ali nije bila predviđena neposredna opasnost. Trepanning was accomplished successfully. Trepanacija je uspešno izvršena. He was bled, and many other of the ordinary means of relief were adopted. Izvršeno mu je puštanje krvi i usvojena su mnoga druga uobičajena sredstva olakšanja. Gradually, however, he fell into a more and more hopeless state of stupor, and finally it was thought that he died. Postepeno, međutim, upao je u sve beznadežniji stupor i konačno mislilo se da je umro. The weather was warm, and he was buried with indecent haste in one of the public cemeteries. Vreme je bilo toplo i sahranjen je s nepristojnom žurbom na jednom od javnih groblja. His funeral took place on Thursday. Njegova sahrana je obavljena u četvrtak. On the Sunday following, the grounds of the cemetery were, as usual, much thronged with visitors, and about noon an intense excitement was created by the declaration of a peasant that, while sitting upon the grave of the officer, he had distinctly felt a commotion of the earth, as if occasioned by someone struggling beneath. U narednu nedelju prostor groblja je, kao i obično, bio prepun posetilaca i oko podneva nastalo je intenzivno uzbuđenje izjavom jednog seljaka, da je, sedeći na grobu oficira, jasno osetio potres zemlje, kao da ga je izazvao neko ko se bori ispod. At first, little attention was paid to the man's asseveration, but his evident terror and the dogged obstinacy with which he persisted in his story had at length their natural effect upon the crowd. U početku se malo pažnje posvećivalo čovekovoj tvrdnji, ali njegovo očigledno zaprepašćenje i tvrdoglava upornost s kojom je insistirao na svojoj priči, konačno su imali prirodan efekat na gomilu. Spades were hurriedly procured, and the grave, which was shamefully shallow, was in a few minutes so far thrown open that the head of its occupant appeared. Ubrzano su nabavljene lopate i grob, koji je bio sramno plitak, za nekoliko minuta je toliko otkopan da se pojavio ukopanikova glava. He was then seemingly dead, but he sat nearly erect within his coffin, the lid of which, in his furious struggles, he had partially uplifted. Tada je izgledao mrtav, ali je sedeo gotovo uspravno unutar svog kovčega, čiji je poklopac u svom besnom boru delimično podigao. He was forthwith conveyed to the nearest hospital and there pronounced to be still living, although in an asphytic condition. Odmah je prevezen u najbližu bolnicu i tamo proglašen za još živog, mada u asfiktičnom stanju. After some hours he revived, recognized individuals of his acquaintance, and in broken sentences spoke of his agonies in the grave. Nakon nekoliko sati oporavio se, prepoznao pojedince iz svog poznanstva i isprekidanim rečenicama govorio o svojoj agoniji u grobu. From what he related, it was clear that he must have been conscious of life for more than an hour while inhumed before lapsing into insensibility. Iz onoga što je ispričao, bilo je jasno da je morao biti svestan života više od sat vremena, dok je bio ukopan, pre nego što je izgubio svest. The grave was carelessly and loosely filled with an exceedingly porous soil, and thus some air was necessarily admitted. Grob je bio nemarno I labavo napunjen izuzetno poroznom zemljom. I tako je nužno prodiralo malo vazduha. He heard the footsteps of the crowd overhead and endeavored to make himself heard in turn. Čuo je korake gomile iznad I pokušavao da I on bude čuven. It was the tumult within the grounds of the cemetery, he said, which appeared to awaken him from a deep sleep. But no sooner was he awake than he became fully aware of the awful horrors of his position. Bila je to, rekao je, galama unutar prostora groblja koja ga je, kako mu se učinilo, probudila iz dubokog sna. Ali čim se probudio, postao je u potpunosti svestan strašnih užasa svog položaja. This patient, it is recorded, was doing well and seemed to be in a fair way of ultimate recovery, but fell a victim to the quackeries of medical experiment. Ovaj pacijent, kako je zabeleženo, dobro je napredoval I izgledalo je da je na dobrom putu ka konačnom oporavku, ali je pao žrtvom šarlatanstava medicinskog eksperimenta. The galvanic battery was applied, and he suddenly expired in one of those ecstatic paroxysms which, occasionally, it superinduces. Primenjena je galvanska baterija, I on je iznenada preminuo u jednom od onih ekstatičnih paroksizama, koje ona povremeno izaziva. The mention of the galvanic battery, nevertheless, recalls to my memory a well-known and very extraordinary case in point, where its action proved the means of restoring to animation a young attorney of London who had been interred for 2 days. Pominjanje galvanske baterije, ipak, podsjeća me na jedan dobro poznat I veoma izvanredan primer, gde je njeno dejstvo bilo sredstvo za povratak u život jednog mladog advokata iz Londona, koji je bio sahranjen 2 dana. This occurred in 1831 and created at the time a very profound sensation wherever it was made the subject of converse. Ovo se dogajalo 1831 godine I izazvalo je u to vreme veoma duboki utisak svuda gde je postalo predmet razgovora. The patient, Mr. Edward Stapleton, had died, apparently of typhus fever, accompanied with some anomalous symptoms which had excited the curiosity of his medical attendants. Pacijent, gospodin Edward Stapleton, preminuo je, naizgled, od tifusne groznice, praćene nekim anomalnim simptomima koji si pobudili znatiželju njegovih lekara. Upon his seeming decease, his friends were requested to sanction a post-mortem examination, but declined to permit it. Nakon njegove prividne smrti, njegovi prijatelji su zamoljeni da odobre post-mortem pregled, ali su odbili da to dozvole. As often happens, when such refusals are made, the practitioners resolve to disinter the body and dissect it at leisure, in private. Kako se često dešava kada se takva odbijanja izvrše, praktičari su odlučili da ekshumiraju telo I disekciraju ga u miru, privatno. Arrangements were easily effected with some of the numerous corps of body snatchers with which London abounds, and upon the 3rd night after the funeral, the supposed corpse was unearthed from a grave 8 feet deep and deposited in the opening chamber of one of the private hospitals. Dogovori su lako ostvareni sa nekim od brojnih korpusa otimača leševa, kojih u Londonu ima u izobilju, I 3. noći nakon sahrane, navodna leš je iskopan iz groba dubokog 8 stopa I smešten u prijemnu salu jedne od privatnih bolnica. An incision of some extent had been actually made in the abdomen, when the fresh and undecayed appearance of the subject suggested an application of the battery. Incizija izvesnog opsega zaista je bila napravljena u stomaku, kada je sveži I neraspadnuti izgled subjekta predložio primjenu baterije. One experiment succeeded another, and the customary effects supervened, with nothing to characterize them in any respect, except, upon 1 or 2 occasions, a more than ordinary degree of lifelikeness in the convulsive action. Jedan eksperiment je sledio drugi I nastupali su uobičajeni efekti, bez ičega što bi ih karakterisalo ni u kom pogledu, osim jednom ili 2 put više nego običnog stepena životnosti u konvulzivnoj radnji. It grew late. Bivalo je kasno. The day was about to dawn, and it was thought expedient, at length, to proceed at once to the dissection. Dan je bio na pomolu i smatralo se uputnim konačno da se odmah pristupi disekciji. A student, however, was especially desirous of testing a theory of his own, and insisted upon applying the battery to one of the pectoral muscles. Jedan student, međutim, naročito je želeo da testira svoju sopstvenu teoriju i insistirao je na primjeni baterije na jedan od prsnih mišića. A rough gash was made, and a wire hastily brought in contact when the patient, with a hurried but quite unconvulsive movement, arose from the table, stepped into the middle of the floor, gazed about him uneasily for a few seconds, and then spoke. Napravljen je grubi rez i žica je žurno dovedena u kontakt. Kada je pacijent brzim, ali sasvim nekonvulzivnim pokretom ustao sa stola, stupio u sredinu sobe, nelagodno pogledao oko sebe nekoliko sekundi i tada progovorio. What he said was unintelligible, but words were uttered. The syllabification was distinct. Ono što je rekao bilo je nerazumljivo, ali reči su izgovorene. Slogovanje je bilo razgovetno. Having spoken, he fell heavily to the floor. Pošto je progovorio, teško je pao na pod. For some moments, all were paralyzed with awe, but the urgency of the case soon restored them their presence of mind. Neko vreme, svi su bili paralizovani strahopoštovanjem, ali hitnost slučaja uskoro im je povratila prisebnost. It was seen that Mr. Stapleton was alive, although in a swoon. Uvidelo se da je gospodin Stapleton živ, mada u nesvesti. Upon exhibition of ether, he revived and was rapidly restored to health, and to the society of his friends, from whom, however, all knowledge of his resuscitation was withheld, until a relapse was no longer to be apprehended. Po davanju etra oporavio se i brzo vratio zdravlju i društvu svojih prijatelja, od kojih je, međutim, svako saznanje o njegovom oživljavanju bilo skriveno, dok više nije bilo razloga za strahovanje od recidiva. Their wonder, their rapturous astonishment may be conceived. Njihovo čuđenje, njihova ushićena zapanjenost može se zamisliti. The most thrilling peculiarity of this incident, nevertheless, is involved in what Mr. S. himself asserts. Najuzbudljivija osobenost ovog incidenta ipak sadržana je u onome što tvrdi sam gospodin S. He declares that at no period was he altogether insensible. Dully and confusedly, he was aware of everything which happened to him from the moment in which he was pronounced dead by his physicians to that in which he fell swooning to the floor of the hospital. Tvrdi da ni u jednom trenutku nije bio potpuno bez svesti, da je tupo i zbunjeno bio svestan svega što mu se dešavalo. Od trenutka kada su ga lekari proglasili mrtvim do onog u kome je onesvešćen pao na pod bolnice. I am alive were the uncomprehended words which, upon recognizing the locality of the dissecting room, he had endeavored, in his extremity, to utter. Živ sam, bile su nerazumljene reči koje je, prepoznavši prostoriju za disekciju, u krajnjoj nuždi pokušao da izgovori. It were an easy matter to multiply such histories as these, but I forbear, for indeed we have no need of such to establish the fact that premature interments occur. Lako bi bilo umnožiti ovakve priče, ali se uzdržavam, jer zaista nemamo potrebe za takvim da bismo ustanovili činjenicu da do prevremenih sahrana dolazi. When we reflect how very rarely, from the nature of the case, we have it in our power to detect them, we must admit that they may frequently occur without our cognizance. Kada razmatramo koliko retko, po prirodi slučaja, imamo moći da ih otkrijemo, moramo priznati da se mogu često dešavati bez našeg saznanja. Scarcely, in truth, is a graveyard ever encroached upon for any purpose to any great extent, that skeletons are not found in postures which suggest the most fearful of suspicions. Retko se, zaista, ikad zadire u groblje, u bilo koje svrhe, u ikakvom velikom obimu, a da se ne nađu skeleti u položajima koji sugerišu najstrašnije sumnje. Fearful indeed the suspicion, but more fearful the doom. Strašna je zaista sumnja, ali je strašnija sudbina. It may be asserted without hesitation that no event is so terribly well adapted to inspire the supremeness of bodily and of mental distress as is burial before death. Može se bez oklevanja tvrditi da ni jedan događaj nije tako strašno pogodan za nadahnuće vrhunca telesnih i mentalnih muka, kao što je sahranjivanje pre smrti. The unendurable oppression of the lungs, the stifling fumes from the damp earth, the clinging to the death garments, the rigid embrace of the narrow house, the blackness of the absolute night, the silence like a sea that overwhelms, the unseen but palpable presence of the conqueror worm. These things, with the thoughts of the air and grass above, with memory of dear friends who would fly to save us if but informed of our fate, and with consciousness that of this fate they can never be informed, that our hopeless portion is that of the really dead, these considerations, I say, carry into the heart, which still palpitates, a degree of appalling and intolerable horror from which the most daring imagination must recoil. Nepodnošljiv pritisak na pluća, gušljivi isparci iz vlažne zemlje, prijanjanje uz pogrebnu odoru, kruto zadrljaje uske kuće, crnoća apsolutne noći, tišina poput mora koje preplavljuje, nevidljivo ali opipljivo prisustvo crva osvajača. Ove stvari, zajedno s mislima o vazduhu i travi iznad sa sećanjem na drage prijatelje koji bi poleteli da nas spasu kad bi samo bili obavešteni o našoj sudbini i sa svešću da o toj sudbini nikada ne mogu biti obavešteni, da je naš beznadežni deo zaista mrtvog. Razmatranja, kažem, unose u srce koje još uvek kuca stepen zapanjujućeg i nepodnošljivog užasa od koga mora da se uzmakne i najsmelija mašta. We know of nothing so agonizing upon earth. We can dream of nothing half so hideous in the realms of the nethermost hell. Ne znamo ni zašta tako mučno na zemlji, ne možemo ni sanjati ništa i upola tako odvratno u carstvima najdubljih predjela pakla. And thus all narratives upon this topic have an interest profound, an interest, nevertheless, which through the sacred awe of the topic itself, very properly and very peculiarly depends upon our conviction of the truth of the matter narrated. I tako, sve pripovedanje o ovoj temi ima dubok interes koji ipak kroz sve to strahopoštovanje prema samoj temi sasvim ispravno i sasvim posebno zavisi od našeg uverenja u istinitost ispripovedane materije. What I have now to tell is of my own actual knowledge, of my own positive and personal experience. Ono što sada imam da ispričam jeste iz mog sopstvenog stvarnog saznanja, iz mog sopstvenog pozitivnog i ličnog iskustva. For several years I had been subject to attacks of the singular disorder which physicians have agreed to term catalepsy, in default of a more definitive title. Nekoliko godina bio sam podložan napadima singularnog poremećaja koji su lekari pristali da nazovu katalepsijom u nedostatku definitivnijeg naziva. Although both the immediate and the predisposing causes, and even the actual diagnosis of this disease are still mysterious, its obvious and apparent character is sufficiently well understood. Mada su i neposredni i predisponirajući uzroci, pa čak i stvarna dijagnoza ove bolesti još uvek tajanstveni, njen očigledan i vidljiv karakter je dovoljno dobro razumljen. Its variations seem to be chiefly of degree. Njene variacije izgledaju da su uglavnom u stepenu. Sometimes the patient lies, for a day only, or even for a shorter period, in a species of exaggerated lethargy. Ponekad pacijent leži samo jedan dan ili čak i kraći period u vrsti preterane letargije. He is senseless and externally motionless, but the pulsation of the heart is still faintly perceptible. Some traces of warmth remain. A slight color lingers within the center of the cheek, and upon application of a mirror to the lips, we can detect a torpid, unequal, and vacillating action of the lungs. On je bez svesti i spolja nepomičan. Ali otkucaji srca su još uvek blago opipljivi. Ostaju neki tragovi toplote. Blaga boja se zadržava unutar sredine obraza. I pri primjeni ogledala na usne možemo da detektujemo tromo, nejednako i kolebljivo delovanje pluća. Then again, the duration of the trance is for weeks, even for months, while the closest scrutiny and the most rigorous medical tests fail to establish any material distinction between the state of the sufferer and what we conceive of absolute death. A onda opet trajanje transa je nedeljama, čak i mesecima, dok najbliže ispitivanje i najstroži medicinski testovi ne uspevaju da utvrde bilo kakvu suštinsku razliku između stanja obolelog i onoga što zamišljamo kao apsolutnu smrt. Very usually, he is saved from premature interment solely by the knowledge of his friends that he has been previously subject to catalepsy, by the consequent suspicion excited, and above all, by the non-appearance of decay. Veoma često spasava se od prevremenog sahranjivanja jedino znanjem prijatelja da je ranije bio podložan katalepsiji, posledičnom pobuđenom sumnjom i pre svega nepojavljivanjem raspadanja. The advances of the malady are luckily gradual. Napredovanje bolesti je srećom postupno. The first manifestations, although marked, are unequivocal. Prve manifestacije, mada primetne, su nedvosmislene. The fits grow successively more and more distinctive and endure each for a longer term than the preceding. Napadi postaju uzastopno sve izrazitiji i svaki traje duže od prethodnog. In this lies the principal security from inhumation. U tome leži glavna zaštita od ukopavanja. The unfortunate, whose first attack should be of the extreme character, which is occasionally seen, would almost inevitably be consigned alive to the tomb. Nesrećnik, čiji bi prvi napad bio onog krajnjeg karaktera koji se povremeno viđa, gotovo neizbežno bi bio živ pedat grobu. My own case differed in no important particular from those mentioned in medical books. Moj sopstveni slučaj se ni u jednoj važnoj pojedinosti nije razlikovao od onih pomenutih u medicinskim knjigama. Sometimes, without any apparent cause, I sank, little by little, into a condition of semi-syncope or half-swoon, and, in this condition, without pain, without ability to stir, or strictly speaking, to think, but with a dull, lethargic consciousness of life and of the presence of those who surrounded my bed, I remained, until the crisis of the disease restored me, suddenly, to perfect sensation. Ponekad, bez ikakvog vidljivog uzroka, tonuo sam, malo po malo, u stanje polusinkope ili polunesvesti. I, u tom stanju, bez bola, bez mogućnosti da se pomerim ili, striktno govoreći da mislim, ali sa tupom letargičnom svešću o životu i o prisustvu onih koji su okruživali moj krevet, ostajao sam dok me kriza bolesti nije iznenada povratila punom osjećaju. At other times I was quickly and impetuously smitten. U drugim prilikama bio sam brzo i žestoko udaren. I grew sick and numb and chilly and dizzy, and so fell prostrate at once. Postajao sam bolestan i utrnuo i hladan i zavrtelo mi se u glavi i tako bih odmah pao ničice. Then, for weeks, all was void and black and silent, and nothing became the universe. Zatim, nedeljama, sve bi bilo prazno i crno i tiho i ništa bi postalo svemir. Total annihilation could be no more. potpuno uništenje ne bi moglo biti više od toga. From these latter attacks I awoke, however with a gradation slow in proportion to the suddenness of the seizure. Iz ovih posljednjih napada budio sam se, međutim s postupnošću sporom u srazmeri sa naglošću napada. Just as the day dawns to the friendless and houseless beggar, who roams the streets throughout the long, desolate winter night, just so tardily, just so wearily, just so cheerily came back the light of the soul to me. Baš kao što dan osviće beskućniku i prijatelju lišanom prosjaku koji luta ulicama tokom duge, opustele zimske noći. Baš tako sporo, baš tako umorno, baš tako veselo vraćala mi se svetlost duše. Apart from the tendency to trance, however, my general health appeared to be good, nor could I perceive that it was at all affected by the one prevalent malady, unless, indeed, an idiosyncrasy in my ordinary sleep may be looked upon as superinduced. Osim sklonosti ka transu, međutim, moje opšte zdravlje izgledalo je kao dobro. Niti sam mogao da primetim da ga je jedina rasprostranjena bolest uopšte pogodila, osim ako zaista jedna idiosinkrazija u mom uobičajenom snu ne može da se smatra naknadnom pojavom. Upon awaking from slumber, I could never gain at once thorough possession of my senses and always remained for many minutes in much bewilderment and perplexity, the mental faculties in general, but the memory in especial being in a condition of absolute abeyance. Budeći se iz sna, nikad nisam mogao odmah da potpuno ovladam čulima i uvek sam ostajao mnogo minuta u velikoj zbunjenosti i nedoumici, mentalne sposobnosti uopšte, a posebno pamćenje, nalazeći se u stanju apsolutnog mirovanja. In all that I endured, there was no physical suffering, but of moral distress and infinitude. U svemu što sam podnosio nije bilo fizičke patnje, ali moralnih muka u beskrajnoj meri. My fancy grew charnel. I talked of worms, of tombs and epitaphs. Moja mašta postajala je grobna. Govorio sam o crvima, o grobovima i epitafima. I was lost in reveries of death, and the idea of premature burial held continual possession of my brain. Bio sam izgubljen u sanjarenjima o smrti. Ideja o prevremenom sahranjivanju neprekidno je vladala mojim mozgom. The ghastly danger to which I was subjected haunted me day and night. Strašna opasnost kojoj sam bio izložen proganjala me je dan i noć. In the former, the torture of meditation was excessive. In the latter, supreme. U prvoj, muka razmatranja bila je preterana. U drugoj, vrhunska. When the grim darkness overspread the earth, then, with every horror of thought, I shook as the quivering plumes upon the hearse. Kada bi mračna tama prekrila zemlju, tada bih sa svakim užasom misli drhtao poput drhtalih perjanica na mrtvačkim kolima. When nature could endure wakefulness no longer, it was with a struggle that I consented to sleep, for I shuddered to reflect that upon awaking, I might find myself the tenant of a grave. Kada priroda nije više mogla da podnosi budnost, sa borbom sam pristajao na spavanje, jer sam drhtao na pomisao da bi se, probudivši se, mogao naći kao stanar groba. And when, finally, I sank into slumber, it was only to rush at once into a world of phantasms, above which, with vast, sable, overshadowing wing, hovered, predominant, the one sepulchral idea. Aj, kada bih, konačno, tonuo u san, bilo je to samo da odmah uhrnim u svet fantazmi, iznad kojih je ogromnim, crnim, zasenjujućim krilom predominantno lebdela jedina grobna ideja. From the innumerable images of gloom, which thus oppressed me in dreams, I select for record but a solitary vision. Od nebrojenih slika tmurnosti, koje su me tako mučile u snovima, Odabiram za beleženje samo jedno viđenje. Methought I was immersed in a cataleptic trance of more than usual duration and profundity. Činilo mi se da sam uronjen u kataleptički trans dužeg I dubljeg trajanja nego uobičajeno. Suddenly there came an icy hand upon my forehead, and an impatient, gibbering voice whispered the word, "Arise," within my ear. Iznenada je ledena ruka prislonjena na moje čelo. I nestrpljiv, brbljav glas šapnuo je reč, "Ustani." Unutar mog uha. I sat erect. Seo sam uspravno. The darkness was total. Mrak je bio potpun. I could not see the figure of him who had aroused me. Nisam mogao da vidim figuru onoga kome je probudio. I could call to mind neither the period at which I had fallen into the trance, nor the locality in which I then lay. Nisam mogao da se setim ni perioda u kome sam upao u trans, ni mesta na kome sam tada ležao. While I remained motionless and busied in endeavors to collect my thought, the cold hand grasped me fiercely by the wrist, shaking it petulantly, while the gibbering voice said again, "Dok sam ostajao nepomičan I zauzet naporima da skupim misli, hladna ruka me je žestoko zgrabila za ručni zglob, trzajući ga razdraženo dok je brbljavi. Glas ponovo rekao, "Arise! Did I not bid thee arise?" Ustani. Zar ti nisam rekao da ustaneš? Oh, what? And who, I demanded, art thou? Akasi, zahtevao sam ti. Dot. I have no name in the regions which I inhabit, replied the voice mournfully. I was mortal, but am fiend. Nemam ime u krajevima u kojima boravim, odgovorio je glas žalosno. Bio sam smrtan, ali sam demon. I was merciless, but am pitiful. Bio sam nemilosrdan, ali sam žalosno biće. Thou dost feel that I shudder. Osjećaš da drhtim. My teeth chatter as I speak, yet it is not with the chilliness of the night without end. Zubi mi škripe dok govorim, ali to nije od hladnoće noći, noći bez kraja. But this hideousness is insufferable. Ali ova strašnoća je nepodnošljiva. How canst thou tranquilly sleep? Kako možeš mirno da spavaš? I cannot rest for the cry of these great agonies. Ne mogu da se odmorim od vapaja ovih velikih agonija. These sights are more than I can bear. Ovi prizori su više nego što mogu da podnesem. Get thee up. Digni se. Come with me into the outer night, and let me unfold to thee the graves. Pođi sa mnom u spoljašnju noć I dopusti mi da ti razotkrijem grobove. Is not this a spectacle of woe? Behold! Nije li ovo prizor jada? Glee! I looked, and the unseen figure which still grasped me by the wrist had caused to be thrown open the graves of all mankind. And from each issued the faint phosphoric radiance of decay, so that I could see into the innermost recesses, and there view the shrouded bodies in their sad and solemn slumbers with the worm. Pogledao sam I nevidljiva figura, koja me je još uvek držala za ručni zglob, bila je uzrokovala da se otvore grobovi čitavog čovečanstva. I iz svakog je izbijalo bledo fosforično sijanje raspada, tako da sam mogao da vidim u najunutarnije utubine I da tamo gledam umotana tela u njihovom tužnom I svečanom snu sa crvom. But alas, the real sleepers were fewer, by many millions, than those who slumbered not at all. And there was a feeble struggling, and there was a general sad unrest, and from out the depths of the countless pits there came a melancholy rustling from the garments of the buried. Ali Avai. Stvarni spavači bili su malobrojniji za mnogo miliona od onih koji nisu uopšte dremali. I tu je bila slabašna borba. I tu je bila opšta tužna nemir. I iz dubina bezbroj jama dopiralo je melanholično šuštanje od odeće sahranjenih. And of those who seemed tranquilly to repose, I saw that a vast number had changed, in a greater or less degree, the rigid and uneasy position in which they had originally been entombed. I od onih koji su izgledali kao da mirno počivaju, video sam da je ogroman broj promenio u većem ili manjem stepenu krut i nelagodan položaj u kome su prvobitno bili sahranjeni. And the voice again said to me as I gazed. A glas mi je ponovo rekao dok sam gledao. Is it not? Oh, is it not a pitiful sight? Nije li? Oh, nije li to žalosno viđenje? ... But, before I could find words to reply, the figure had ceased to grasp my wrist. The phosphoric lights expired, and the graves were closed with a sudden violence, while from out them arose a tumult of despairing cries, saying again, Is it not, O God, is it not a very pitiful sight? Ali, pre nego što sam mogao da nađem reči da odgovorim, figura je prestala da drži moj ručni zglob. Fosforična svetla su se ugasila i grobovi su se zatvorili naglom silom, dok je iz njih nastalo vreva očajnih vapaja, ponavljajući: Nije li to, o Bože, nije li to veoma žalosno viđenje? Fantasies such as these, presenting themselves at night, extended their terrific influence far into my waking hours. Fantazije poput ovih, javljajući se noću, širile su svoj strašan uticaj daleko u moje bdene sate. My nerves became thoroughly unstrung, and I fell a prey to perpetual horror. Nervi su mi se sasvim rasuli i postao sam plen neprekidnog užasa. I hesitated to ride or to walk or to indulge in any exercise that would carry me from home. Oklevao sam da jaham ili da hodam ili da se predajem bilo kakvom vežbanju koje bi me odvelo od kuće. In fact, I no longer dared trust myself out of the immediate presence of those who were aware of my proneness to catalepsy, lest, falling into one of my usual fits, I should be buried before my real condition could be ascertained. Zaista, više nisam smeo da se pouzdam izvan neposrednog prisustva onih koji su bili svesni moje sklonosti ka katalepsiji, da, upavši u jedan od mojih uobičajenih napada, ne budem sahranjen pre nego što se moje pravo stanje moglo utvrditi. I doubted the care, the fidelity of my dearest friends. Sumnjao sam u brigu, u vernost mojih najdražih prijatelja. I dreaded that, in some trance of more than customary duration, they might be prevailed upon to regard me as irrecoverable. Strahujao sam da bi u nekom transu dužem od uobičajenog mogli biti privedeni da me smatraju neizlečivim. I even went so far as to fear that, as I occasioned much trouble, they might be glad to consider any very protracted attack as sufficient excuse for getting rid of me altogether. Čak sam otišao toliko daleko da sam strahovao da bi, budući da sam zadavao mnogo nevolje, bili zadovoljni da svaki veoma produženi napad smatraju dovoljnim izgovorom da se sasvim reše mene. It was in vain they endeavored to reassure me by the most solemn promises. Uzalud su pokušavali da me umire najtorženijim obećanjima. I exacted the most sacred oaths that under no circumstances they would bury me until decomposition had so materially advanced as to render farther preservation impossible. Tražio sam najsvetije zakletve da ni pod kojim okolnostima neće me sahraniti. Dok raspadanje ne uznapreduje toliko materijalno da dalje čuvanje postane nemoguće. And even then my mortal terrors would listen to no reason, would accept no consolation. I, čak I tada, moji smrtni terori, nisu hteli da slušaju nikakav razlog. Nisu hteli da prihvate nikakvu utehu. I entered into a series of elaborate precautions. Preduzeo sam niz razrađenih mera predostrožnosti. Among other things, I had the family vault so remodeled as to admit of being readily opened from within. Između ostalog, dao sam da se porodična grobnica tako preradi da omogući lako otvaranje iznutra. The slightest pressure upon a long lever that extended far into the tomb would cause the iron portal to fly back. Najmanji pritisak na dugu polugu koja se protezala duboko u grobnicu uzrokovao bi da gvozdeni portal odskoči nazad. There were arrangements also for the free admission of air and light, and convenient receptacles for food and water within immediate reach of the coffin intended for my reception. Napravljeni su i aranžmani za slobodan pristup vazduha i svetlosti, i zgodni spremnici za hranu i vodu, u neposrednom domašaju kovčega namenjenih za moj pijem. This coffin was warmly and softly padded, and was provided with a lid, fashioned upon the principle of the vault door, with the addition of springs, so contrived that the feeblest movement of the body would be sufficient to set it at liberty. Ovaj kovčeg je bio toplo i meko tapaciran i opremljen poklopcem izrađenim. Po principu vrata grobnice, uz dodatak opruga tako skovanih, da bi najslabiji pokret tela bio dovoljan da ga oslobodi. Besides all this, there was suspended from the roof of the tomb a large bell, the rope of which, it was designed, should extend through a hole in the coffin, and so be fastened to one of the hands of the corpse. Pored svega ovoga, sa krova grobnice bilo je obešeno veliko zvono, čije je užad prema planu trebalo da se proteže kroz rupu u kovčegu i da bude pričvršćena za jednu od ruku mrtvaca. But, alas, what avails the vigilance against the destiny of man? Ali, avaj, šta vredi budnost nasuprot sudbini čoveka? Not even these well-contrived securities suffice to save from the uttermost agonies of living inhumation, a wretch to these agonies foredoomed. Čak ni ova dobro osmišljena bezbednosna sredstva nisu bila dovoljna da spasu od krajnjih agonija živog ukopavanja jadnika koji je tim agonijama bio unapred osuđen. There arrived an epoch, as often before there had arrived, in which I found myself emerging from total unconsciousness into the first feeble and indefinite sense of existence. Nastupio je trenutak, kao što je često ranije nastupao, u kome sam se našao kako izazim iz potpune nesvesti u prvi slabašan i neodređen osjećaj postojanja. Slowly, with a tortoise gradation, approached the faint gray dawn of the cycled day. Polako s kornjačastom postupnošću približavala se bleda siva zora psihičkog dana. A torpid uneasiness. Trauma nelagodnost. An apathetic endurance of dull pain. Apatično podnošenje tupe boli. No care, no hope, no effort. Nikakva briga, nikakva nada, nikakav napor. Then, after a long interval, a ringing in the ears. Then, after a lapse still longer, a prickling or tingling sensation in the extremities. Then, a seemingly eternal period of pleasurable quiescence, during which the awakening feelings are struggling into thought. Then a brief resinking into non-entity. Then a sudden recovery. Zatim, posle dugog intervala, zvonjava u ušima. Zatim, posle još dužeg razmaka, peckanje ili trnci u ekstremitetima. Zatim, naizgled večan period prijatnog mirovanja, tokom koga se buđajuća osjećanja bore prema misli. Zatim kratko ponovno tonjenje u nepostojanje. Zatim iznenadan oporavak. At length, the slight quivering of an eyelid, and immediately, thereupon, an electric shock of a terror, deadly and indefinite, which sends the blood in torrents from the temples to the heart. Konačno blago drhtanje kapka i odmah potom električni šok terora, smrtonosnog i neodređenog, koji šalje krv u potocima od slepoočnica do srca. And now, the first positive effort to think. I sada prvi pozitivni napor da se misli. And now, the first endeavor to remember. Sada prvi pokušaj da se zapamti. And now, a partial and evanescent success. I sada delimičan I prolazni uspeh. And now, the memory has so far regained its dominion that, in some measure, I am cognizant of my state. I sada je pamćenje toliko povratilo svoju dominaciju da sam u izvesnoj meri svestan svog stanja. I feel that I am not awaking from ordinary sleep. Osjećam da se ne budim iz uobičajenog sna. I recollect that I have been subject to catalepsy. Sećam se da sam bio podložan katalepsiji. And now, at last, as if by the rush of an ocean, my shuddering spirit is overwhelmed by the one grim danger, by the one spectral and ever-prevalent idea. I sada, konačno, kao da ga udara nalet okeana, moj drhtavi duh je preplavljen jednom mračnom opasnošću, jednom spekalnom I sveprisutnom idejom. For some minutes after this fancy possessed me, I remained without motion. Nekoliko minuta nakon što me je ova pomisao obuzela, ostao sam bez pokreta. And why? Zašto? I could not summon courage to move. Nisam mogao da skupim hrabrosti da se pomerim. I dared not make the effort, which was to satisfy me of my fate, and yet there was something at my heart which whispered me it was sure. Nisam smeo da uložim napor koji bi trebalo da me uveri u moju sudbinu, a ipak je nešto u mom srcu šaptalo mi da je to sigurno. Despair, such as no other species of wretchedness ever calls into being, despair alone urged me, after long irresolution, to uplift the heavy lids of my eyes. Očajanje, kakvo ni jedna druga vrsta bede nikad ne priziva u postojanje. Samo me je očajanje, posle dugog oklevanja, nagnalo da podignem teška kapka svojih očiju. I uplifted them. Podigao sam ih. It was dark, all dark. Bilo je mračno, sve mračno. I knew that the fit was over. Znao sam da je napad prošao. I knew that the crisis of my disorder had long passed. Znao sam da je kriza mog poremećaja odavno prošla. I knew that I had now fully recovered the use of my visual faculties. And yet it was dark, all dark, the intense and utter raylessness of the night that endureth forevermore. Znao sam da sam sada u potpunosti povratio upotrebu svojih vizualnih sposobnosti. A ipak je bilo mračno, sve mračno, intenzivno I potpuno odsustvo svetlosti, noći koja traje zauvek. I endeavored to shriek, and my lips and my parched tongue moved convulsively together in the attempt, but no voice issued from the cavernous lungs, which, oppressed as if by the weight of some incumbent mountain, gasped and palpitated with the heart at every elaborate and struggling inspiration. Pokušao sam da vrisnem, I moje usne I moj isušeni jezik konvulzivno su se zajedno pomerali u tom pokušaju, ali ni jedan glas nije izišao iz šupljastih pluća, koja, opterećena kao težinom neke nadleže planine, laptuhu I kucahu zajedno sa srcem, na svakom smišljenom I napornom udahu. The movement of the jaws in this effort to cry aloud showed me that they were bound up, as is usual with the dead. Pokret vilica, u ovom naporu da viknem naglas, pokazao mi je da su bile svezane, kako je uobičajeno sa mrtvima. I felt, too, that I lay upon some hard substance, and by something similar my sides were also closely compressed. Osjetio sam takođe da ležim na nekakvoj tvrdoj substanci I nečim sličnim moja su boka isto tako bila čvrsto stisnuta. So far, I had not ventured to stir any of my limbs, but now I violently threw up my arms, which had been lying at length, with the wrists crossed. Dotad nisam smeo da pomeram ni jedan ud, ali sada sam nasilno podigao ruke, koje su bile ispružene su krštenim ručnim zglobovima. They struck a solid wooden substance, which extended above my person at an elevation of not more than 6 inches from my face. Udarile su u čvrstu drvenu supstancu koja se protezala iznad mog tela na visini pod ne više od 6 inča od mog lica. I could no longer doubt that I reposed within a coffin at last. Više nisam mogao da sumnjam da konačno počivam unutar kovčega. And now, amid all my infinite miseries, came sweetly the cherub hope, for I thought of my precautions. I sada, usred svih mojih beskonačnih nevolja, slatko je dolazila heruvimska nada, jer sam pomislio na svoje mere predostrožnosti. I writhed and made spasmodic exertions to force open the lid. It would not move. Grčio sam se i činio grčevite napore da na silu otvorim poklopac. Nije hteo da se pomeri. I felt my wrists for the bell rope. It was not to be found. Pipao sam ručne zglobove tražeći uže od zvona. Nije se nalazilo. And now the comforter fled forever, and a still sterner despair reigned triumphant. For I could not help perceiving the absence of the paddings which I had so carefully prepared. And then, too, there came suddenly to my nostrils the strong, peculiar odor of moist earth. I sada je utešiteljica zauvek pobegla, i još surovije očajanje je triumfovalo. Jer nisam mogao da ne primetim odsustvo tapaciranja koje sam tako pažljivo pripremio. I tada je, isto tako, iznenada dopro do mojih nozdrva jak i osobit miris vlažne zemlje. The conclusion was irresistible. Zaključak je bio neodbijaj. I was not within the vault. Nisam bio unutar grobnice. I had fallen into a trance while absent from home, while among strangers, when, or how, I could not remember, and it was they who had buried me as a dog, nailed up in some common coffin, and thrust deep, deep, and forever into some ordinary and nameless grave. Bio sam upao u trans, dok sam bio odsutan od kuće, dok sam bio među strancima, kada, ili kako, nisam mogao da se setim, i to su oni koji su me sahranili kao psa, zakucali u neki običan kovčeg i gurnuli duboko, duboko i zauvek u neki običan i bezimeni grob. As this awful conviction forced itself, thus, into the innermost chambers of my soul, I once again struggled to cry aloud. Dok se ovo strašno uverenje, dakle, nametalo u najunutarnije odaje moje duše, ponovo sam se borio da viknem naglas. And in this second endeavor I succeeded. I u ovom drugom pokušaju uspeo sam. A long, wild, and continuous shriek or yell of agony resounded through the realms of the subterranean night. Dugačak, divlji i neprekidan krik ili urlik agonije odjeknuo je kroz carstva podzemne noći. Hello, hello there, said a gruff voice in reply. Hey, hey, onamo, rekao je grub glas u odgovoru. What the devil's the matter now, said a second. Šta đavo sad ima, rekao je drugi. Get out of that, said a third. Gubi se odande, rekao je treći. What do you mean by yowling in that air kind of style, like a cattymount, said a fourth. And hereupon I was seized and shaken without ceremony for several minutes by a junto of very rough-looking individuals. Šta misliš time što urličeš na taj onakav način, kao divlja mačka? Rekao je četvrti. I na to sam bio uhvaćen i tresen bez ceremonije. Nekoliko minuta od strane klika veoma grubog izgleda pojedinaca. They did not arouse me from my slumber, for I was wide awake when I screamed, but they restored me to the full possession of my memory. Nisu me probudili iz sna, jer sam bio sasvim budan kada sam vrisnuo, ali su mi povratili puno vladanje pamćenjem. This adventure occurred near Richmond in Virginia. Ova avantura se desila u blizini Richmonda, u Virginiji. Accompanied by a friend, I had proceeded upon a gunning expedition some miles down the banks of the James River. Praćen prijateljem, bio sam krenuo u lovački izlet, nekoliko milja nizvodno duž obala reke James. Night approached, and we were overtaken by a storm. Noć se primicala I zadesila nas je oluja. The cabin of a small sloop lying at anchor in the stream and laden with garden mold afforded us the only available shelter. Kabina malog broda, usidrenog u struji, natovarena vrpnom zemljom, pružila nam je jedino dostupno sklonište. We made the best of it and passed the night on board. Izvukli smo maksimum iz situacije I proveli noć na palubi. I slept in one of the only 2 berths in the vessel, and the berths of a sloop of 60 or 20 tons need scarcely be described. Spavao sam u jednoj od svega 2 ležaja na brodu, a ležaj jedrenjaka od 60 ili 20 tona jedva da trebaju biti opisani. That which I occupied had no bedding of any kind. Onaj koji sam zauzimao nije imao posteljinu ni od kakve vrste. Its extreme width was 18 inches. Njegova krajnja širina bila je 18 inča. The distance of its bottom from the deck overhead was precisely the same. Rastojanje njegovog dna od palube iznad bilo je upravo jednako. I found it a matter of exceeding difficulty to squeeze myself in. Utvrdio sam da je ugurati se unutra stvar izuzetne teškoće. Nevertheless, I slept soundly, and the whole of my vision, for it was no dream, and no nightmare arose naturally from the circumstances of my position, from my ordinary bias of thought, and from the difficulty, to which I have alluded, of collecting my senses, and especially of regaining my memory, for a long time after awaking from slumber. Ipak sam čvrsto spavao I čitavo moje viđenje, jer to nije bio san, niti noćna mora. Nastalo je prirodno iz okolnosti mog položaja, iz moje uobičajene sklonosti misli I iz teškoće na koju sam aludirao, skupljanja čula I posebno povratka pamćenja, dugo vremena po buđenju iz sna. The men who shook me were the crew of the sloop and some laborers engaged to unload it. Muškarci koji su me treli bili su posada jedrenjaka I neki radnici angažovani da ga istovaraju. From the load itself came the earthly smell. Od samog tereta dolazilo je zemaljski miris. The bandage about the jaws was a silk handkerchief in which I had bound up my head, in default of my customary nightcap. Zavoj okovilica bio je svilena maramica kojom sam obmotao glavu, umjesto uobičajene noćne kape. The tortures endured, however, were indubitably quite equal for the time to those of actual sepulture. Muke koje sam podnosio, međutim, bile su nesumnjivo sasvim jednake, za to vreme, onima od stvarnog sahranjivanja. They were inconceivably hideous. But out of evil proceeded good, for their very excess wrought in my spirit an inevitable revulsion. Bile su strašno, bile su nezamislivo odvratne, ali iz zla je proisteklo dobro, jer upravo je njihov višak izazvao u mom duhu neizbežno zgražavanje. My soul acquired tone, acquired temper. Moja duša je stekla tonus, stekla je smirenost. I went abroad. Išao sam u svet. I took vigorous exercise. Vežbao sam snažno. I breathed the free air of heaven. Disao sam slobodan vazduh nebesa. I thought upon other subjects than death. Razmišljao sam o drugim temama osim o smrti. I discarded my medical books. Odbacio sam svoje medicinske knjige. Bucken, I burned. Bačana sam spalio. I read no night thoughts. No fustian about churchyards. No bugaboo tales such as this. Nisam čital noćne misli. Nikakve bombastične priče o grobljima, nikakve strašljive priče poput ove. In short, I became a new man and lived a man's life. Ukratko, postao sam novi čovek I živeo muški život. From that memorable night, I dismissed forever my charnel apprehensions, and with them vanished the cataleptic disorder, of which perhaps they had been less the consequence than the cause. Od te nezaboravne noći zauvek sam odbacio grobne strahove I s njima je nestao kataleptički poremećaj, čija su možda bila manje posljedica nego uzrok. There are moments when, even to the sober eye of reason, the world of our sad humanity may assume the semblance of a hell, but the imagination of man is no Carathis to explore with impunity its every cavern. Ima trenutaka kada, čak I treznom oku razuma, svet naše tužne čovečnosti može poprimiti izgled pakla. Ali mašta čoveka nije karatida, da istraži nekažnjeno svaku njenu pećinu. Alas, the grim legion of sepulchral terrors cannot be regarded as altogether fanciful, but like the demons in whose company Afrasiab made his voyage down the Oxus, they must sleep, or they will devour us. They must be suffered to slumber, or we perish. Avaj, mračna legija grobnih terora ne može se smatrati sasvim izmišljenom, ali poput demona u čijem je društvu Afrasiab obavio svoje putovanje niz Oks, oni moraju da spavaju, ili će nas proždrati, mora im se dozvoliti da dremaju, ili ćemo propasti. The end. Thank you for listening. We wish you a wonderful day and best of luck in your language learning journey.